I never thought storing diesel fuel in my garage would land me in the middle of a legal nightmare. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Vanderhoff decided my emergency preparedness was somehow a threat to the neighborhood. It started on a Tuesday morning in February when I was finishing my coffee and heard the sharp rap of knuckles against my front door. I lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a tidy subdivision in Gilbert, Arizona, where the houses all had beige stucco and red tile roofs that looked like they'd been stamped from the same cookie cutter. I'd bought the place 3 years ago, thinking it would be a quiet spot to settle down after my divorce. The HOA seemed reasonable enough at first, just the usual stuff about keeping your lawn green and not painting your house purple. I opened the door to find Patricia standing there with her arms crossed, her highlighted blonde hair sprayed into submission despite the morning breeze. She was the vice president of the HOA board, a title she wore like a military rank. Behind her stood another woman I recognized as Linda from 2 streets over, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Peter Vance," Patricia said, even though she knew damn well who I was. "We'd been neighbors for 3 years. That's me. What can I do for you, Patricia? We've received complaints about hazardous materials being stored on your property," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false authority that made my teeth clench. "I need to inspect your garage immediately." I blinked at her. "Hazardous materials? What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. We know you have fuel stored in there, large quantities of fuel. That's a fire hazard and a violation of Section 12.4 of the HOA covenant." She waved a hand dramatically. "You're putting the entire neighborhood at risk." I had to take a breath to keep from laughing. "You mean my diesel containers? For my generator?" "I don't care what you're using it for. It's dangerous and it needs to go." "Patricia, I have a backup generator because the power grid out here isn't exactly reliable. Remember last summer when we had those rolling blackouts? I had $2,000 worth of food in my freezer and a home office I run my business from. The diesel is stored in approved containers, properly sealed in a ventilated space. It's completely legal." Linda scribbled something on her clipboard. Patricia's face reddened. "Legal or not, it violates HOA rules. You have 48 hours to remove it or we'll be forced to take action." "What action?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Fines? Liens? Whatever it takes to maintain the safety and property values of this community." I could feel my blood pressure rising. "Show me exactly where in the covenant it says I can't store fuel for emergency preparedness." Patricia's mouth opened and closed. "I don't have to show you anything. I'm telling you right now that it's a violation." "Then I guess we're done here," I said, starting to close the door. "I'm calling the police," she shouted. "If you won't comply, they'll make you comply." "Storing dangerous chemicals is probably illegal anyway." I paused. "You're going to call the cops because I have diesel fuel for my generator?" "Yes, I am, today, right now." She pulled out her phone like she was drawing a sword. "Go ahead," I said, too tired to argue further. "I'll be here." I closed the door and went back to my coffee, figuring that would be the end of it. Patricia liked to make threats, but actually following through required more effort than she usually wanted to invest. I had work to do anyway. I was a freelance software consultant, which meant my entire income depended on having reliable power and internet. The generator had been one of the smartest investments I'd made. The diesel fuel in question consisted of 6 5-gallon jerry cans, the proper metal kind with the spouts that sealed tight. I'd bought them from a reputable supplier, and they sat on a shelf in my garage, properly ventilated, away from any ignition sources. I'd even checked with the fire marshal's office when I first set up my emergency system. They told me that 30 gallons of diesel, stored properly, was well within legal limits for residential storage. Diesel wasn't even particularly flammable compared to gasoline. It required compression to ignite, which was why diesel engines worked the way they did. I settled back into my work, helping a client debug some database issues, and forgot about Patricia's tantrum. That lasted about an hour. The doorbell rang. Then came the heavy knock that only cops seem to master. I saved my work and headed to the door, genuinely surprised that Patricia had actually called them. 2 Gilbert police officers stood on my porch, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The older one, a guy in his 40s with graying temples, had his thumbs hooked in his belt. The younger officer, a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, held a notepad. "Peter Vance?" the older officer asked. "That's me. I'm Officer Daniels. This is Officer Chen. We got a call about hazardous materials being stored at this address. Mind if we take a look?" I stepped aside. "Not at all. Come in." They followed me through the house to the garage. I hit the button to raise the door, letting in the bright Arizona sunshine. My generator sat in the corner, a serious piece of equipment I'd spent $2,000 on. Next to it, neatly arranged on a metal shelf, were my 6 jerry cans. Officer Daniels walked over and examined them. He picked one up, checked the seal, looked at the labeling. Officer Chen peered at my setup, taking notes. "These are all diesel?" Daniels asked. "Yes, sir. 5 gallons each. 30 gallons total, all approved containers properly stored." He set the can back down. "What's the generator for?" "Backup power. I work from home and we get outages fairly regularly. I have a transfer switch installed so I can power my essentials without backfeeding into the grid." Daniels nodded slowly. "You have any gasoline stored here?" "No, sir. Just the diesel." Generator's a diesel model specifically because it's safer and more efficient for long-term storage. Officer Chen spoke up. "Who called this in?" "Patricia Vanderhoff. She's the HOA vice president. She came by this morning claiming I was violating some rule and threatening the neighborhood." Daniels and Chen exchanged a glance. Daniels pulled out his phone and took a few photos of my setup. "Mr. Vance, I'm going to be straight with you. This is completely legal. You're well under the storage limits for residential diesel fuel. These containers are appropriate, properly sealed, and from what I can see, you're following all safety guidelines. There's no violation here." Relief washed through me. That's what I tried to tell her. "Did Mrs. Vanderhoff actually see these containers?" Chen asked. "No, I didn't let her in. She just demanded to inspect and started making accusations." Daniels shook his head. "Okay, here's the thing. We have to respond to these calls, but this is pretty clearly a false report. There's no emergency here, no safety hazard, nothing illegal. We're going to have a conversation with Mrs. Vanderhoff about wasting police resources." "I appreciate that. You got any documentation for this setup?" Daniels asked. "Permits, inspection records, anything like that?" "I've got the receipts for everything, and I called the fire marshal's office when I first set this up to make sure I was doing it right. I think I have notes from that conversation. Mind emailing those to me?" He handed me a card. "Just as backup in case this goes further." "Sure, no problem." The officers left and I sent them the documentation. Then I got back to work, figuring that would be the end of it. Patricia had been told off by the cops. She'd slink away embarrassed, and life would go on. I should have known better. That evening, I found a notice taped to my door. It was printed on official HOA letterhead and informed me that I was being fined $500 for storing hazardous and inflammable materials in violation of community standards. Furthermore, I had 72 hours to remove said materials or face additional daily fines of $100. I called my neighbor Mike, who'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates since it was built. He was retired military, a no-nonsense guy who'd butted heads with the HOA more than once. "They're really going after you?" he asked when I explained the situation. "Apparently. Even after the cops told them it was legal." Mike snorted. "That's Patricia for you. She doesn't care about legal. She cares about control. You know, she tried to fine me because my garage door was tan instead of beige. Swore up and down it was a violation. Turned out the builder had installed 3 different shades of tan and beige throughout the development, and mine was one of them. She had to back down, but she was pissed." "What do I do here?" "Fight it. Request a hearing with the board. Document everything, and I mean everything. Every interaction, every email, every letter. These people will lie through their teeth if they think they can get away with it." I took Mike's advice. I sent a formal letter to the HOA board disputing the fine and requesting a hearing. I attached the police report number, photos of my setup, documentation from the fire marshal's office, and a copy of the relevant sections of Arizona state law regarding residential fuel storage. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. I spent the weekend preparing, printing out more documentation, highlighting the relevant statutes, and generally building a case like I was going to trial. Tuesday evening came. The community center was a bland building next to the neighborhood pool, with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that hummed incessantly. About a dozen residents had shown up, probably hoping for entertainment. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front, Patricia in the center, flanked by the president, a soft-spoken accountant named Gregory Walsh, and the secretary, a perpetually anxious woman named Susan Martinez. I took a seat in the front row. Patricia wouldn't meet my eyes. Gregory called the meeting to order and worked through some routine business about pool maintenance and landscaping contracts. Then he cleared his throat. "Next item. The board has issued a violation notice to Peter Vance regarding improper storage of hazardous materials. Mr. Vance has requested a hearing to dispute this notice." "I'd like to hear from Mr. Vance first," Susan said, clicking her pen nervously. I stood and approached the table. "Thanks for giving me the opportunity to address this. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. I store diesel fuel for my backup generator, 30 gallons total, in approved containers, in a properly ventilated space. This is completely legal under Arizona law." I handed them copies of my documentation. "I've included the relevant statutes, a statement from the fire marshal's office, and the police report from when Officer Daniels and Officer Chen responded to the call last week. They confirmed that my setup is legal and safe." Patricia snatched the papers. "This isn't about state law. This is about HOA covenants. We have rules for a reason." "Which specific rule am I violating?" I asked calmly. "Section 12.4. No hazardous materials." I pulled out my copy of the covenants. I'd highlighted the relevant section. "Section 12.4 prohibits the storage of hazardous materials in violation of local, state, or federal law. Since my storage complies with all applicable laws, this section doesn't apply." Patricia's face flushed. "That's your interpretation. That's what the words say." Gregory looked uncomfortable. He scanned the documents I'd provided. "Mr. Vance, I have to say, this looks pretty thorough. Patricia, did you actually verify that this was illegal before issuing the violation?" "I don't need to verify anything. It's obviously dangerous." "But the police said it wasn't," Susan pointed out timidly. "The police don't enforce HOA rules," Patricia snapped. "No, but they enforce safety laws," I said, "and they confirmed I'm in compliance. Look, I understand concern about safety. That's exactly why I researched this thoroughly before setting up my system. Diesel fuel is less flammable than gasoline. It requires heat and compression to ignite. The containers are approved for fuel storage. Everything is properly ventilated. I'm being as safe as possible." Gregory set down the papers. "I'm inclined to rescind this violation. Mr. Vance is clearly in compliance with the law, and the covenant clause specifically references legal compliance. We can't set a precedent that residents can just store whatever they want," Patricia protested. "He's not storing whatever," Susan said, finding some backbone. "He's storing fuel for emergency preparedness. That seems reasonable." "I vote to rescind the violation," Gregory said. "I second that," Susan added. Patricia glared at both of them. "This is ridiculous. Fine. But if there's an incident, it's on your heads." She gathered her papers aggressively, shoving them into a folder. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but uneasy. Patricia had that look in her eye, the one that said this wasn't over. I was right to be worried. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more violation notices. One claimed my lawn was a 1/4 inch too long. Another said my trash cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. The third cited me for parking my truck in my driveway instead of the garage, even though half the neighborhood did the same thing. Each violation came with a $50 fine. Each one required me to submit a written response and supporting documentation. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Patricia's fingerprints were all over it. I took photos of my lawn next to my neighbor's lawns, all of which were the same length. I documented that trash collection happened at 6 a.m. and I'd brought my cans in by 7 p.m., well within the rules. I provided photos showing at least 15 other houses with vehicles in their driveways. Mike stopped by one evening with a 6-pack of beer. "She's retaliating," he said, settling into one of my patio chairs. "Classic Patricia move. She can't get you on the fuel thing, so she's going to nickel and dime you to death. It's harassment at this point." "Yeah, but proving that is harder. You need a pattern of behavior, documentation that she's targeting you specifically while ignoring the same violations by others." Mike took a sip of his beer. "I went through something similar a few years back. Had to get a lawyer involved before she backed off. A lawyer. For HOA stuff. These things can escalate fast. Fines turn into liens. Liens can lead to foreclosure in extreme cases. I'm not saying it'll get that far, but Patricia's got a mean streak, and she hates losing. I didn't want to spend money on a lawyer for what amounted to petty neighborhood drama, but Mike's warning stuck with me. I started documenting everything even more meticulously. Every violation notice, every response, every interaction. I took photos of the entire neighborhood, cataloging all the minor violations that Patricia ignored when committed by others. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I was mowing my lawn on a Saturday morning when a woman approached from across the street. I recognized her as Teresa Abbott, a nurse who worked odd hours and mostly kept to herself. "Peter," she called out. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I killed the mower. "Sure, what's up?" Teresa looked nervous. "I heard about what Patricia's been doing to you, the violation notices and everything. Word travels fast. It's a small neighborhood. Look, I wanted you to know that she did the same thing to me last year." I straightened. "Really?" "Yeah. I have solar panels installed. She tried to claim they were an eyesore and violated the architectural standards. Never mind that the covenants were written before solar panels were even a thing, so there's nothing in there about them. She issued violation after violation, tried to fine me thousands of dollars. What happened? I fought it. Eventually, I filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They oversee HOA operations. Turns out Patricia had been abusing her position for years, issuing bogus fines, pocketing some of the money, using her position to harass people she didn't like. The department investigated and found all kinds of irregularities. My pulse quickened. So what was the outcome? She got a formal reprimand, had to pay back some of what she'd taken, but she's still on the board. The president, Gregory, he's too passive to push her out, and nobody else wants to deal with the hassle of running for the board. So she's still there, still pulling the same garbage. That's insane. I know. But here's the thing. If enough people file complaints, if there's a pattern of abuse, the state can force changes. They can even dissolve an HOA board in extreme cases. I kept all my documentation from my case. If you're building a case against her, I can provide evidence of her past behavior. That would be incredibly helpful. Teresa gave me her contact information. Over the next few days, she sent me a trove of documents, violation notices that were clearly retaliatory. Emails where Patricia made threats. Records showing she'd selectively enforced rules against people she had personal grudges against while ignoring the same violations by her friends. I also reached out to other neighbors. Once people knew I was pushing back, several others came forward with their own stories. Patricia had terrorized a young couple over the color of their mailbox. She tried to prevent another family from building a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son, claiming it was aesthetically inappropriate. She'd even attempted to ban a veteran from flying the American flag, arguing it violated the no flagpole rule, even though he was using a wall-mounted flag holder. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Patricia Vanderhoff was a bully who'd been using her HOA position as a personal fiefdom for years. I compiled everything into a comprehensive complaint and submitted it to the Arizona Department of Real Estate. I also sent copies to every member of the HOA board and scheduled another appearance at the next board meeting. But before that meeting could happen, Patricia made her biggest mistake yet. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was on a video call with a client when I heard shouting outside. I muted myself and went to the window. Patricia was in my driveway, along with two men I didn't recognize. One of them had a dolly and they were opening my garage door. I ended the call and rushed outside. "What the hell are you doing?" Patricia spun around. "Enforcing HOA rules since you refuse to comply. These gentlemen are removing the hazardous materials from your property." "You can't do that. That's my property." "The HOA has the right to abate violations at the owner's expense," she said smugly. "It's in the covenants." That clause applies to external violations like overgrown lawns or junk cars, not for entering someone's private garage and removing their legal property. What you're doing is theft and trespassing. One of the men looked uncomfortable. "Lady, if he's saying this isn't authorized, we can't just take his stuff." "I'm authorizing it as HOA vice president," Patricia insisted. "That's not how that works," I said. I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police, again." Patricia's confidence faltered. "You're being dramatic." "You're literally trying to steal my property." "How is that dramatic?" The two men with the dolly backed away. "We're not getting involved in this," one of them said. "You didn't tell us the owner was disputing this." They left. Patricia stood in my driveway, her face scarlet. "This isn't over." "You're right, it's not." I called the police. Officer Daniels showed up again, this time with a different partner. I explained what had happened. Patricia tried to argue that she had the authority to remove violations, but Daniels shut her down. "Madam, you can't enter someone's private property and remove their belongings without a court order, HOA board or not. What you attempted is theft and trespassing. Mr. Vance would be within his rights to press charges." Patricia went pale. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." "From legal diesel fuel storage that we've already established poses no threat." Daniels looked tired. "Mrs. Vanderhoff, This is the third time we've responded to calls involving you and Mr. Vance. The first was a false report. Now you've attempted to unlawfully seize his property. I'm issuing you a citation for filing a false police report and for attempted theft. You can't do that. I absolutely can. Daniels wrote out the tickets with brisk efficiency. You'll receive a court date in the mail. I strongly suggest you leave Mr. Vance alone from here on out. Patricia snatched the tickets and stormed off to her car, peeling out of my driveway with a screech of tires. Officer Daniels turned to me. You might want to consider a restraining order. This is harassment at this point. I've got a complaint filed with the state real estate department. I'm hoping that'll resolve things. Good. But seriously, document everything. If she keeps this up, legal action might be your only option. After Daniels left, I sat in my living room trying to process what had just happened. Patricia had actually tried to have my property seized. The woman had gone completely off the rails. Mike called me that evening. Dude, half the neighborhood is talking about what happened. Patricia tried to steal your fuel. She brought guys with a dolly to haul it away. She's lost her mind. Listen, there's a special board meeting tomorrow night. Emergency session. Gregory called it. I think they're finally going to do something about her. The meeting was packed. It seemed like every resident of Meadowbrook Estates had shown up. I arrived early and took a seat near the front. Teresa was there, along with several other people I'd spoken to while building my complaint. The room buzzed with conversation. Gregory called the meeting to order. He looked haggard. Thank you all for coming. This meeting has been called to address serious concerns regarding the conduct of HOA board members, specifically Vice President Patricia Vanderhoff. Patricia sat at the board table with her arms crossed, glaring at everyone. Gregory continued. We've received multiple complaints, including a comprehensive report filed with the state. Additionally, there was an incident yesterday involving an unauthorized attempt to remove property from a resident's home. The board has reviewed the situation, and frankly, it's untenable. Susan spoke up. I move that Patricia Vanderhoff be removed from her position as vice president, effective immediately. Second, Gregory said. Patricia stood abruptly. You can't do this to me. I've dedicated years to this community. You've abused your position, Gregory said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. You've harassed residents, issued fraudulent violations, and yesterday you attempted to commit theft. The police have cited you twice now. This board cannot and will not tolerate that behavior. I was protecting property values. You were protecting your ego, Susan said quietly. We've seen the complaints, Patricia. Years of them. You've been targeting anyone who doesn't bow to your demands. A vote was called. It was unanimous. Patricia was removed from the board. She gathered her things in furious silence, then pointed at me. This is your fault. You and your stupid generator. You're going to regret this. Is that a threat? Gregory asked sharply. Patricia didn't answer. She stormed out of the community center. The room erupted in conversation. Over the next few weeks, things gradually returned to normal. The bogus violation notices stopped. The Arizona Department of Real Estate completed their investigation and issued findings against Patricia, including financial penalties and a ban from serving on any HOA board in the state for 5 years. Patricia's court date for the false report citation came up. I attended, partly out of curiosity and partly to make sure justice was actually served. The courtroom was small, just a municipal judge handling minor offenses. Patricia showed up with a lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman who tried to argue that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that her client was simply zealous about neighborhood safety. The prosecutor presented the facts. Patricia had called the police about a non-existent hazard. Officers had confirmed the fuel storage was legal. When that didn't work, she'd escalated to attempting to seize the property herself. The judge wasn't impressed. Patricia was found guilty of filing a false police report and attempting to commit theft. She was fined $2,000, sentenced to 40 hours of community service, and placed on probation for 1 year. If she had any further incidents, she'd face jail time. I saw her in the courthouse hallway afterward. She wouldn't look at me. Her lawyer was talking to her in low, urgent tones. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Mike met me in the parking lot. Justice served. Something like that. You know she's selling her house, right? Word is she can't stand living here anymore after being kicked off the board. Can't say I'm sorry to see her go. A lot of people feel that way. You did the neighborhood a favor, man, standing up to her like that. I drove home thinking about the past few months. All of this because I'd wanted to make sure I had backup power during an outage. It seemed absurd in retrospect. But that was the thing about petty tyrants like Patricia. They thrived on control, on making people bend to their will, and when someone pushed back, they escalated until they destroyed themselves. Meadowbrook Estates got a new vice president, a retired school teacher named Margaret who actually read the covenants before making decisions. The HOA board started operating the way it was supposed to, handling legitimate maintenance issues and community concerns without the personal vendettas and power trips. My generator sat in my garage, ready for the next power outage, which came about 6 months later during a particularly nasty monsoon storm. The electricity went out for 14 hours. My neighbors struggled with spoiled food and dead phones. I ran my generator, powered my essentials, and even let Mike and Teresa run extension cords over to charge their devices and keep their refrigerators going. Nobody complained about the diesel fuel. One evening about a year after the whole mess started, I was sitting on my patio with a beer, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. Teresa walked over with a bottle of wine. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always." "What's up?" She settled into the chair next to me. "I just wanted to say thank you for fighting back against Patricia. I tried, but I didn't have the energy to see it through. You did, and you made a real difference. I'm not sure I did anything that special. I just refused to let her bully me. That's exactly what was special about it. Most people just roll over. They pay the bogus fines, they follow the ridiculous rules because it's easier than fighting. You showed everyone that standing up to these petty dictators is possible." I thought about that. You know what the funny thing is? I almost gave in. After the 3rd or 4th violation notice, I seriously considered just getting rid of the fuel. It would have been easier. But then I thought about what that would mean. It would mean Patricia won. It would mean anyone with a little authority could push me around. And now she's gone, and we have a functioning HOA board instead of Patricia's personal kingdom. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken. Lights came on in houses across the neighborhood. Someone was barbecuing, the smell of grilling meat drifting on the evening air. Kids were playing in a yard down the street, their laughter carrying in the cooling air. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. People living their lives, handling the mundane business of community maintenance without drama or dictatorship. It had taken months of documentation, stress, and confrontation to get here, but it was worth it. Teresa left after finishing her wine. I stayed outside a while longer, thinking about the bizarre journey that had started with a simple knock on my door. Patricia had tried to turn my emergency preparedness into a crisis. She'd called the police, issued bogus violations, attempted theft, and ultimately destroyed her own position and reputation. and all I'd done was refuse to back down when I knew I was right. The generator in my garage was more than just a backup power source now. It was a reminder that sometimes standing your ground matters, that documentation and persistence can overcome bullying and abuse of authority. That communities work better when people are willing to call out those who abuse positions of trust. I finished my beer and went inside. My phone buzzed with an email. It was from Gregory, the HOA president. The subject line read, "Proposed Covenant Amendment." I opened it. The board was proposing to amend the covenants to explicitly allow emergency preparedness measures, including backup generators and reasonable fuel storage, as long as they complied with local and state laws. They wanted community input before the vote. I smiled and typed out a response supporting the amendment. It felt like things had come full circle. What Patricia had tried to ban would now be explicitly protected. Her attempt to exert control had resulted in residents having more freedom, not less. Over the following months, the amendment passed with overwhelming community support. Other residents started installing their own backup power systems. Mike got a generator. The family with the wheelchair ramp added solar panels. Teresa expanded her solar array. Meadowbrook Estates became a model for sensible HOA governance, where rules existed to maintain property values and community standards without infringing on reasonable personal choices. Patricia moved away quietly. Her house sold below market value. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd relocated to Scottsdale, to a community without an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The court ordered community service she'd been sentenced to involved working at a public park, picking up trash and maintaining facilities. Mike saw her there once and reported that she looked miserable. I didn't take any particular pleasure in that. Mostly, I just felt relieved that the whole situation was over. Life returned to its normal rhythm. Work projects came and went. I dated a woman I met through a client, though that didn't last. Mike and I became better friends, bonding over our shared experience of HOA drama. Teresa and I formed a neighborhood watch group that actually focused on real safety concerns rather than lawn height enforcement. The annual HOA meeting that year was refreshingly boring. Budget discussions, pool maintenance schedules, landscaping contracts. Gregory ran things efficiently. Margaret contributed thoughtful questions. The new treasurer, a CPA who'd volunteered for the position, presented transparent financial reports that showed exactly where community fees were going. During the open forum portion, an older resident named Arthur stood up. "I just want to say that this past year has been a real turnaround for our community. We went from an atmosphere of fear and petty enforcement to one where people feel comfortable in their own homes. I think Peter Vance deserves recognition for standing up to the old regime and helping bring about that change." There was applause. I felt my face heat up. I appreciate that, but honestly, I was just protecting my own property. The real credit goes to people like Teresa, who documented the problems years ago, and to Gregory and the rest of the board for actually taking action when it mattered. More applause. It felt good, but also strange. I'd never set out to be any kind of neighborhood hero. I just wanted to keep my food from spoiling during power outages. After the meeting, several people approached me with their own stories of past run-ins with Patricia. It was cathartic for them to share, I think. To acknowledge that they hadn't been crazy, that she really had been as unreasonable and vindictive as they'd thought. An elderly man named Frank shook my hand with surprising strength. "She tried to fine me for having a bird feeder, said it attracted pests." Never mind that half the neighborhood has bird feeders. When I pointed that out, she told me that if I didn't remove it, she'd make my life hell. Those were her exact words. "What did you do?" "Took down the bird feeder. I'm 83 years old. I don't have the energy to fight." But seeing you stand up to her, seeing her get what she deserved, that meant something to me. These conversations put the whole experience in perspective. Patricia's reign hadn't just been annoying. It had genuinely hurt people. Elderly residents like Frank who'd felt threatened in their own homes. Families like the one with the disabled son who'd been shamed for making necessary accommodations. Veterans who'd been told they couldn't honor their service. I'd been lucky in some ways. I was relatively young, financially stable, and stubborn enough to fight back. Not everyone had those advantages. The system had allowed Patricia to run roughshod over vulnerable people for years, and it was only when someone had the resources and will to push back that things had changed. That realization stuck with me. I started paying more attention to HOA governance, not just in Meadowbrook Estates, but across Arizona. I learned that our situation wasn't unique. Across the country, HOA boards were notorious for abusing their authority, for petty enforcement of arbitrary rules, for targeting residents who dared to question their decisions. I wrote an article about my experience and submitted it to a local newspaper. To my surprise, they published it. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from people across the Phoenix metro area dealing with similar HOA issues. Some were worse than mine. One family was facing foreclosure because they'd painted their front door the wrong shade of approved colors. Another had been fined thousands of dollars because a tree on their property was deemed insufficiently maintained, even though it was perfectly healthy. I started compiling resources for these people. Information about Arizona HOA law, contact information for the state regulatory agencies, sample letters for disputing violations. I created a simple website to host this information. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place where people could find the tools they needed to fight back against abusive HOA practices. The website grew. I added a forum where people could share their experiences and advice. Lawyers who specialized in HOA law reached out offering to do free consultations. A state legislator contacted me about proposed reforms to HOA governance laws. What had started as my personal fight over diesel fuel storage had evolved into something larger. It became about accountability, about ensuring that the people entrusted with governing communities actually served those communities rather than their own egos. 2 years after the initial incident with Patricia, I was invited to speak at a state legislature committee hearing on HOA reform. I testified about my experience, about the systematic abuse of authority, about the need for stronger oversight and easier avenues for residents to challenge bogus violations. The reforms that eventually passed weren't perfect, but they helped. They established clearer standards for what constituted legitimate violations. They created a streamlined process for disputing fines. They increased penalties for board members who abused their positions. I thought about Patricia sometimes. I wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, or if she'd just moved on to find new targets in a different setting. I hoped for the former, but suspected the latter. People like her rarely changed. They just found new domains to control. But I'd learned something important. I'd learned that standing up to bullies matters, even when it's exhausting and frustrating. I'd learned that documentation and persistence can overcome arbitrary authority. I'd learned that most people, given the choice, prefer fairness over control. My generator still sat in my garage, still powered by the same 30 gallons of diesel fuel that had started the whole mess. It had proven its worth many times over during outages, but its real value wasn't in the electricity it produced. It was in what it represented. It represented the right to prepare for emergencies in your own home, the right to make reasonable decisions about your own property, the right to push back when authority overreaches, the right to demand accountability from those entrusted with power. Every time I refilled those diesel cans, every time I ran a maintenance cycle on the generator, I thought about that. I thought about Patricia's red face as she insisted I was endangering the neighborhood. I thought about Officer Daniels shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. I thought about the citations Patricia had received, the removal from the board, the court conviction. Most of all, I thought about Frank taking down his bird feeder because he was too old and tired to fight. I thought about all the people who'd been bullied into submission by someone who'd confused authority with entitlement. The generator hummed to life smoothly whenever I tested it. The diesel fuel remained safely stored in its approved containers. The HOA board functioned properly, addressing real community needs without harassment or overreach. Meadowbrook Estates had become the kind of neighborhood I'd hoped for when I first moved in. On a warm spring evening 3 years after everything had started, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard. Mike was there with his wife. Teresa brought her boyfriend. Gregory and his husband came by. Even Margaret, the new vice president, stopped in with homemade cookies. We stood around my patio, eating burgers and drinking beer, talking about normal things. Upcoming pool renovations. The new families moving into the neighborhood. A proposed community garden. Nobody mentioned Patricia. Nobody talked about violations or fines or police reports. It was just neighbors being neighbors. It was what community was supposed to be. As the sun set and people started heading home, Mike lingered behind. "You know what's funny?" he said, nursing the last of his beer. "What's that?" 3 years ago, you moved here looking for a quiet place to live. Then you ended up in the middle of a neighborhood war, got the cops called on you multiple times, had to testify in court, speak at the state legislature, the whole 9 yards. Not exactly the peaceful life you were planning, I laughed. No, definitely not. Would you do it again? If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you still buy the house? Still install the generator? Still fight Patricia? I thought about that. It had been stressful, time-consuming, and at times genuinely frightening. Patricia's escalation to attempted theft had been scary. The possibility of liens and legal fees had kept me up at night. There had been moments when I'd seriously questioned whether standing my ground was worth it, but I looked around my backyard. At the generator, that kept my life running during outages. At the neighborhood that had transformed from a place of fear to one of community. At the friendships I'd formed through the struggle. At the positive changes that had rippled out from one man refusing to back down. Yeah, I said finally. I would, because it mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone Patricia had bullied, and everyone she might have bullied in the future. Sometimes you have to fight the small battles so they don't become big ones. Mike raised his beer. To fighting the small battles, I clinked my bottle against his. To fighting the small battles. The stars came out over Gilbert, Arizona. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past playing music too loud. Life went on, normal and peaceful and blessedly free of HOA drama. My generator sat in the garage, ready for the next emergency. The diesel fuel was properly stored, legally compliant, and completely safe. And if anyone ever had a problem with that again, I had 3 years of documentation, legal precedent, and a community of neighbors who'd learned the value of standing together against unreasonable authority. It was a good place to be. It was a good life to live. And it had all started with one woman's irrational crusade against emergency preparedness, and one man's refusal to pretend she was right when he knew she was wrong. Sometimes the smallest things matter most. A generator. 30 gallons of diesel. The willingness to document everything and fight back. The courage to stand in front of an HOA board and say, "No, you're wrong." These small acts of resistance against petty tyranny add up. They create communities where people feel safe in their homes, where rules serve legitimate purposes rather than feeding someone's need for control, where neighbors support each other instead of living in fear of the next violation notice. As I locked up for the night, I checked the generator one last time. Fuel levels good, oil clean, battery charged. Ready for whatever came next. That was all anyone could really ask for, to be prepared, to stand your ground, to fight for what's right even when it's hard. The house was quiet as I turned off the lights. Meadowbrook Estates settled into the comfortable silence of a neighborhood at rest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. And somewhere out there, stored safely in approved containers in a properly ventilated garage, 30 gallons of diesel fuel sat waiting to power a generator that had inadvertently powered a revolution in neighborhood governance. It was almost poetic in a way. Patricia had wanted to eliminate what she saw as a threat. Instead, she'd threatened the wrong person and it had cost her everything. The fuel remained. The generator remained. Justice remained. Sometimes things work out the way they should.